Okay, so as promised, I'm going to answer some questions. I have three. The reason I haven't done this before is I haven't had any questions for, well, I've had one question for a while and another couple have come in just recently. So if this is useful, send in more questions because, this is reasonably easy for me to do. And I think it's a good way of getting you some feedback. So anyway, let's just deal with the questions. Question one. So this is a question about Hobbes. And the question is, by the way, I'm not including the names of the people who sent the questions. If you want me to, do that, but I just thought maybe you wouldn't want me to, so I didn't. If you want me to, just tell me that you want me to, but whatever. So if justice is whatever the sovereign says, wouldn't that cause more conflict, thus resulting in, I guess, heading back to the state of nature? For example, the events leading up to the Magna Carta, where the king had imposed heavy taxes, resulting in conflict between barons and the king. Hobbes has a pessimistic view of government due to his upbringing and experiences he faced. Okay, well, first of all, thanks for this question. It's a really interesting question. It raises a lot of issues and could be really interesting to discuss this live in front of you in class, but that's not what's happening. So let me just try and say a few things about this. The first thing I'd say is I don't think that Hobbes does have a pessimistic view of government. I think he's quite optimistic about government, but he does have a pessimistic view about something, and that is that he has a quite pessimistic view about us. I think he's quite pessimistic about the kind of people that we are, and in particular, it's not so much that he thinks that we're all terrible or whatever. He just thinks that we are constructed, or we are such creatures that we can't get on. Right, without government. And so this is why I say he's not really pessimistic about government, because for him, government's the solution. But the problem is us. The solution is government. And we talked about that in relation to the social contract, and remember the argument that there's a kind of logic in the social contract that pushes people into conflict. So he's very pessimistic about that. That's true. But government's the solution. It's important to remember that for him, government's the solution. Now, I think for Hobbes, it's not the case that it's just okay for the government to do whatever it wants. That's not true. There are moral constraints on government. And so you might then ask, well, why does Hobbes say then that justice is whatever the sovereign says it is? I mean, if he thinks that there are moral constraints on what governments ought to do, why does he say that justice is whatever the sovereign says it is? And the answer is that though he thinks that there are moral constraints on what governments ought to do, you and I, the citizens of a country, don't have any authority to impose those moral constraints on the sovereign. All right, so there are these moral constraints out there, but that doesn't give us any authority over the sovereign. It doesn't give us any power to tell the sovereign how the sovereign ought to govern. And, if we don't talk the way that Hobbes spoke, we would never say that justice is whatever justice in New Zealand today is whatever the government says it is. We don't think that. But Hobbes would say, okay, you use different language than me. You used words differently. But how different are things today really? So, for example, I'm presenting this during our second lockdown, New Zealand's second lockdown, where Auckland is under level 3 and the rest of the country is under level 2. Now, there are lots of people in New Zealand who think that these lockdown restrictions are unjust. And they might decide as a result to violate those lockdown restrictions. They might decide to do things that are currently illegal. And if they do, what's the consequence of that? Will the government just say, will the government in the broad sense, like will the police and so on, just say, oh yeah, they think it's unjust, so therefore we should just let them do it? No, of course they won't. right? They will enforce the law. In fact, interestingly enough, the police have been around my neighbourhood in the last couple of days, knocking on doors, and not on our door as it happens, but checking on people and making sure that it looks as if they're making sure that people are staying within their bubbles. And I live quite a long way north. I'm north of the North Shore here, so I'm not near the zone of where the outbreak is. So I'm quite a long way from the outbreak, but they're still doing this here. Now, what Hobbes would say is, in our system, you can question the government, you can think what you like, but you have to obey, right? And that's what he means. That's what he means when he says that justice is whatever the sovereign commands. What's just is what the sovereign commands. So now Hobbes isn't saying that we all have to agree, we all will agree, we all have to agree. He's just saying we have to obey, right? That's what matters. Now, I'm really glad you brought up the issue of the Magna Carta, because it's very interesting. What would Hobbes say about the Magna Carta? And I think one of the things that he would say, it was a very lucky escape. So what happened in the end was that King John agreed to the terms of the Magna Carta and then went on to violate them later, right? But at the time, at the signing of the Magna Carta, he agreed to the terms of the Magna Carta. And of course, we celebrate that. We think it's wonderful because we think the Magna Carta is a very important document. The problem, however, is imagine that John didn't sign, right? Imagine that a civil war broke out. Well, it would be a civil war in which you could imagine that a very significant percentage of the population would have died. And Hobbes's view is that living under a certain amount of injustice is actually better than being killed in a civil war. And of course, we can see, given his experiences, that's what he lived through. So I'm not saying, the point of this is not to say, you should agree with Hobbes on this. The point, though, is to say that Hobbes's position isn't quite as strange as it might appear at first glance. He's not saying it's morally all right for the sovereign to do whatever the sovereign wants. There are moral constraints on what the sovereign should do, but that's the sovereign's business. Right? We don't have any authority to enforce that on the sovereign, and if we think about it, we don't here in New Zealand either. Well, we get to vote, but that voting is not the same thing. Okay, so again, great question. I'm not, I don't agree with Hobbes, so I'm not suggesting that you agree with him, but perhaps his view isn't quite as strange as it might seem at first glance. Okay, here's the second question. Now, I'm not going to read it all out because it's quite long. You might just pause the video and read it. There was actually a bit more that I've just cut out so that you could read it. But what I take the question to be getting at is, look, this is in relation to, say, for example, the forced organ transplant case, as that's an objection to utilitarianism. You remember the case, you've got 5 people, one needs a heart transplant, one needs a liver transplant, they've got 2 kidneys, and right, the story, and then you've got this sort of homeless guy and you can just sort of kill him and take the kidneys. Is that something that you ought to do? And the question asks, well, you might imagine a society existing where people think that that is the right thing to do. In fact, maybe you can imagine a society in which this sort of thing happens. And what are we to say about that? Now, in particular, how do we understand this in the light of my objection to utilitarianism, my one? So remember how it went. There's this problem. You say to the utilitarian, look, you'd have to take this, you'd have to kill this homeless guy and take out his vital organs. What a terribly unjust theory. And then the utilitarian responds to this by saying, no, I wouldn't have to do that, because if you think about it, you'll see that if you lived in a society like that, it wouldn't be a very nice one to live in. It would be one in which utility was not maximised, because you'd be very worried about falling asleep outside and so on. It would be a terrible place to live. Now, my response to that is to say, remember, this is back from the episode on this. Just to summarise, my response is, well, you're getting the right result there, but for the wrong reasons. The reason that it's wrong to kill the homeless person is not because it has bad consequences. The reason that it's wrong to kill the homeless person is because it's wrong to kill innocent people like this. Okay, now this question raises an issue about that. It says, well, imagine that there was a society in which people had decided that they would kill people in those circumstances. What would you say about that? Okay, so now here's my response to the question. The first thing to say is what we're trying to examine in this course is what actually is just and unjust. We're looking at theories about what justice and injustice actually is. We're not looking at questions about what do people think justice and injustice is, what do societies believe is just and unjust. We're interested in what justice is, Now, it may well be that a society might come to a conclusion that something is just, and they might just be wrong about that. In fact, I think we would ordinarily believe that most societies in the history of the world have got things wrong in the past. And I guess a classic example of that would be slavery. Nearly every society in history has had slavery. There are very few societies that have existed without slavery historically. And it still exists today. Right? Slavery is seems unfortunately to be growing today. There was even a case of slavery in New Zealand recently, right? As you may know, it hit the news last week or the week before. Slavery is something that has been condoned in societies for most of history, and yet today we regard it as abhorrent. Now, the question that we're interested in is not what do societies have, what do they think about slavery? What have societies thought about slavery? The question we're asking is it actually just or unjust? Right. So that's the first point I want to make. We're not interested in what people, we're not interested in what societies have thought about these things. Those are interesting questions. They're just not questions for this course. So it's not the subject of this investigation. We're trying to figure out what actually is just or unjust. And so what I want to say about a society that decides that it's okay to sacrifice the one person for the benefit of everybody, I want to say that that society is unjust, no matter what the people in that society think. Now, going on in the question, the student asked, can't we, aren't there circumstances in which we think it would be wrong to sacrifice the interests of the majority for the interests of the minority? And that's absolutely right. I think that's right. But there's something peculiar about this case. We're not just talking about the homeless person's interests. We're talking about his rights. And that's different. So there are circumstances in which, we live in a democracy. The majority is going to win, right? On issues that are up for democratic decision-making. But with respect to these issues, it's right that the majority should succeed. So, for example, on a lot of issues, like, for example, what the speed limit should be, maybe that's just something that we can agree on democratically. How our healthcare service should be organised and how it should be funded, that's something that can be left for decision-making, democratic decision-making. But the idea is that there are some things that are so morally important that the interests of other people can't trump the rights of another. And this would be a case. No matter how much I want a kidney, I can't justify killing somebody to steal that person's kidney. But that's the idea. All right, so the idea is that there are some rights, or whatever you want to call them, that people have that are so important to them that it would not be justified to violate them in order to benefit other people. Okay, so that's a great question too. And in a way, the long answer to that question comes from the rest of the course, because we're about to turn to John Rawls, where we start looking at people who are more focused on rights. So the long answer to this good question will come from the rest of the material that we look at in the course. Okay, next question. All right, so here's the third question. This is in relation, this is my question. It's a question on one of the quizzes. And the question that the student asked was, why is the right answer the right answer? So that's great, by the way. That's a really good question to ask me. Okay, so the question was, Bentham argued that wealth should not be distributed because A, that would be unfair to those who have earned it legitimately. B, it would be a violation of natural rights to property. C, it is just that wealth is held by the industrious. D, it would disincentivize industry. Okay. All right. Now, what we got to remember, first of all, is that Bentham is a utilitarian. So the answer has to be because of the consequences. Wealth should not be redistributed because the consequences would be bad. Or not suboptimal, not as good as they could be. That's what we've got to look for. We've got to look for an argument that focuses on the consequences. So we can rule out any answer that doesn't refer to consequences. So A is wrong. It would be unfair to those who've earned it legitimately. Well, I can't, no, because that's not an argument that's not an argument that refers to consequences. And B, it would be a violation of natural rights to property. No, that doesn't refer to consequences. Right? That refers to other moral considerations. Right? But Bentham doesn't think that they exist. The only thing that matters are the consequences. There are no natural rights to property, thinks Bentham. There are no natural rights at all, thinks Bentham. And C is wrong for exactly the same reason. It's just that wealth is held by the industrious. Well, what does just mean? What do you mean it's just? Right, that's a moral consideration. That's different from the principle of utility. A, B, and C would all be agreed to by Locke, but Bentham's different. He thinks the only reason that something should or shouldn't be done is because of the consequences. So D's the right answer. It would disincentivize industry. What does that mean? It would mean that people would work less hard. To cut a long story short, people would work less hard, and so there would be less wealth. That's a consequence that would be bad. So D's the right answer. Okay, so that's great that I'll have all these questions. Please send more, including, I didn't really understand your response to my question. That's a perfectly good question to send me. I hope that this will be of some use to you. Cheers.